Why do some plants like to be eaten? Now, I admit I have chosen a provocative title because the first thing, plants don't want to do anything as far as we know. Okay, I'm anthropomorphizing here. They're not like saying, hey, give me, eat me, right? They're not doing that, right? What I will say is that there are some plants that respond to getting eaten or parts of their body taken away from things like deer or insects, and they can respond in turn to reproduce still if they get a lot of damage to their leaves or to their flowers or things like that. And so what I'm going to be talking about are different ways that plants have evolved. So I'm going to be talking about natural selection here for the most part, ways to deal with getting eaten or even avoiding being eaten. So if you're a gardener like I am, you know that there are certain plants that get a lot of damage. Things like broccoli, cabbage, they get destroyed, okay? Radish. It turns out that they can take a lot of damage basically on their leaves, but they can still grow, okay? So I'm going to be talking about that phenomenon and things that are related to that phenomenon. So without further ado, here we go. So I've used this word already, but I just want to make sure that you guys know what I'm talking about. So herbivory just means when an animal eats a part of a plant, okay? It doesn't have to be an herb. It can be a tree. We still call it herbivory. Roughly 10 to 15% of all plant tissue is going to die because it's going to be eaten by animals. And that, I don't think that counts agricultural species. So if ag species weren't protected by pesticides, it would be super high. Okay, some crops get 50% of their leaves damaged and things like that. And to be sure, in general, this is not a good thing for plants. It's not a good thing because it usually reduces their reproductive capabilities. So they make less tissue, they make fewer flowers, and they make fewer seeds for the next generation. So it's not necessarily good. In fact, it's mostly bad. And so what I want to bring in are two kind of concepts that are really related to each other. One is called resistance and one is tolerance. And as I was writing this out, I was like, man, those are such loaded words in other parts of academia, right? It's like resistance and tolerance. Whoa, it's so loaded. For me, it has a very specific meaning, and I'm only talking about green plants. So they resist and they also tolerate. So I'll tell you exactly what that means. So an example of a plant that has a lot of resistance is milkweed. So milkweed is what do people know about milkweed? Butterflies, right? Monarchs, right? So monarchs, this is one of their host plants. One of their main host plants is common milkweed. Actually, they feed on other types of milkweed. Milkweed is filled with these nasty, nasty chemicals. And that's some of the larvae or the caterpillars of the monarch can sequester or use some of that toxin to avoid being eaten from birds and things like that. That's why they're on there. It turns out that a lot of plants have chemical compounds in them to make them unpalatable or even dangerous to insects. I will say that there are specialist insects that can get around these types of resistant traits, things like the monarch, things like milkweed bugs. Sometimes you'll see tons of these orange beetles on your milkweed pods. They're eating the seeds, so they also can tolerate that kind of resistant trait. This is usually costly, and that's because a lot of these compounds that cause resistance have a lot of nitrogen in them, and nitrogen for plants is very, very limiting. It's like one of the things that they really, really need. You know this because when you add fertilizer to plants, a lot of it is nitrogen, and they go crazy because they're what we call nitrogen limited. But since they're nitrogen limited, these toxins are pretty costly to produce. Another way that you can think about avoiding damage or the results of damage from insects or animals is to have a dog around. No, I'm just kidding. So this is just a scale. This is a very small dog, but it's a very big root. Okay. So this is a wild cucumber root. You can kind of see the leaves up there, but it's common name in California is called man root. And I know it's gendered, but it could be woman root. It could be child root, right? It just means it's as big as a man, a very, very small man, right? But I point this out because some plants have so much storage underneath the ground that they can get their tops eaten out a lot. And they have so much resources that next year they'll just grow again, right? They'll just have a lot of resources. And this is what's called tolerance. They're tolerating damage. So they're not trying to avoid it at all. They're not putting a lot of toxins into their leaves, although some of them do. They're almost, if I can anthropomorphize, they're saying, well, I'm going to get eaten anyway. I'm going to grow really fast to make up for that loss of tissue. Okay, so for many years, ecologists like myself thought that resistance and tolerance traits wouldn't necessarily be found in the same plants, because if you're a tolerant, you have to show that trait when you're being eaten, so you probably wouldn't have any traits that would make you avoid being eaten, right? And vice versa. We now know that some plants actually have pretty good resistance and pretty good tolerance, so that model has gone out the window, and we're still trying to work on this. But these are the two main ways that ecologists think about how do plants deal with herbivory. Here's the one example that I want to start off, and this one is probably the most provocative. It was a very provocative paper when it came out. Since then, and this paper came out in 1987, since then there have been many, many pages of ink-filled fights in the journals about this phenomenon, okay? It was, as far as plant ecologists go, it was pretty knock down, drag them out, except it was only, over coffee and stuff like that. It wasn't like anything physical going on here, but this plant I'm talking about here is called Scarlet Gilia, and there is a plant also called Gilia. This is not it. And this is another problem with common names is often they're not very accurate, okay? This plant is actually called Ipomopsis aggregata. It lives in the western United States. It grows like this. It's a biennial. So what happens is in the first year it grows a little rosette of leaves, and then the second year the flowering shoots come up and they get pollinated by hummingbirds. And so what happens is that, there's the flowers. What happens is that people have found in certain populations, so certain collections of these individuals, they actually tend to do a lot better. So here's the paper, when they're browsed, okay, by elk. And so when the elk eat them, basically in the beginning of their second year, they make a whole lot of stems. Here's an uneaten control, so this one wasn't browsed, it was protected from elk damage. And you can see that the one that was being eaten is a lot bigger. And it's not just that the top part, or the vegetative and the leaves part, is the only thing that's bigger, but actually the root is bigger too, which is very unusual to see this. And so what people did was like, how is this possible? How can it be better? It turns out that this really is better. They make more fruit, they make more seed. It doesn't look like the offspring of the seed are less healthy than the ones that weren't browsed. And so what is going on here? This is the plant where it's really provocative. It doesn't like to be eaten, right? It seems like it should be, because if you want to get your offspring into the next generation, you want to be bigger, you want to put in a lot of seeds into the next generation, stuff like that. And what's really going on here, there's Sherlock, right? What's really going on, the old Sherlock, is this thing called apical dominance, which if you garden or you have plants, you kind of know about this, is that the top part of the plant usually sends chemicals down that repress these buds. If you ever look at a leaf, there's a little bud between the stem and the leaf, and that is a secondary bud, and a whole new shoot can come out of those. Okay, but they usually don't come out unless the plant is very old, or if you take the top part of the plant off. Okay, so if there's some herbivore that takes the top part off, all these lateral buds will come shooting out. That's probably what's happening with Ipomopsis aggregata or Scarlet Gilia. It turns out that people were very, very upset about this, because it seems just flies in the face of common sense and what we think about natural selection. It turns out that there was only certain populations that actually showed this trait. So this is a trait of tolerance. And this is something that's called tolerance. It's tolerating damage, but it's also called overcompensation. So you're not just like getting to be as good as you would be without any damage. You're going over the top. I'm overcompensating for this, right? It's like a person that buys a really fancy car. They're overcompensating for something, right? This plant is overcompensating for something, right? But it seems to do pretty well. And it turns out there's only a few populations in which there are genes that allow for this tolerance to happen. So it's not like all of these plants do very well when they're browsed. Some of them just do crappy when they're browsed, okay? And this is due to natural selection, we think, in these populations of this species. So these populations that grow really well after being browsed are in areas where there's regular amounts of herbivores or elks coming through every year, or they had been in the past. So they had been selected to deal with something that is coming down the pike in their lifetime, especially the second year. Now, other places where there aren't very many elk, those plants don't do better. So it's not as if the whole species does better when it's eaten. It's only those ones where it'll be beneficial to regrow really fast after being eaten that we see these traits. So it's very restricted. So that's where we are in that kind of area. But I also want to talk about some other types of plants where damage or destruction of tissue is not necessarily a bad thing for the plant. This is just, it's really hard to see here, but this is just showing you a recent paper that's looking at, it's called a meta-analysis, so it's aggregating a lot of data together. And basically what it's showing you is that everything on the right of that dotted line are plants that are in these different families or in these different functional groups and things that overcompensate. So these plants in the literature are known to grow better, to do better in some circumstances when they're eaten versus when they're not eaten. So there's quite a few, and this just came out. So we used to think it was only 2 species or so. There's about 70 species, which is not a lot considering there's 350,000 species of plants, but it's still pretty interesting. So here's another example. So what is this? It's a fig, right? So being in California, sometimes when I was a poor graduate student, I would walk by these homes that had mission figs, and I would just like fill my bag full up with figs because, hey, nobody's going to eat them, right? So they might as well be for me. So figs are an interesting example of what's called a mutualism. It's a pollination mutualism. So a mutualism is normally what happens is there's 2 organisms that are together, and they both benefit when they're together versus when they're apart. So the classic kind of mutualism is pollination mutualisms, where a plant sometimes needs a pollinator to come to move pollen around from different plants to another for sexual reproduction. This is the case here where these figs actually need a wasp to move pollen around from one plant to the other. And in that process, they also lose some tissue to the wasp. Okay, so it's kind of this paradox. They're definitely getting in something in return. The wasp is getting something in return. Sorry, the fig is getting something in return. They're getting sexual reproduction. But what is the wasp getting in this case? You may have heard this story, but I think it's really one of the coolest natural history stories out there. And so there's a lot of words on here, but I'm going to show you how this works. So the wasp is that one up at the top left, and this is a female wasp. And it doesn't look like a typical wasp that we would see right out in the yard or on the ground or things like that. They're very, very small. And we're going to start off with a wasp that has a bunch of pollen on it. They got it from another flower or another what's called Stinkonium. And so that thing that looks like a fruit is actually a collection of flowers, but all the flowers are on the inside. Okay, so it's not a fruit with a bunch of seeds in it yet. It's just if you open up a fig, you're going to see a bunch of flowers on the inside. Instead of facing outward, they're facing inward. That's called a Stinkonium. So what happens is the pollen-laden female goes through this thing called the ostiole. That's the kind of hole in there. And what she does is that she's pregnant, and she lays some of her eggs in the flowers in the Stinkonium. Okay? She's doing that so that they will have food for the next generation of wasps. That's what she's getting. She's getting reproduction as well. So it's this nice, comfy home where her offspring can live and grow. In the process of doing that, just by chance, she's also got all this pollen, so she's pollinating all the female flowers in the Stinkonium at the same time. So she is acting to pollinate the plant. She's also acting to put her eggs inside some of the flowers of the plant. And those flowers will be eaten by the wasp babies, basically. Okay, so there's the trade. I'm trading, I'm trying to get a place for my wasp babies to live, and in return, I'm pollinating the plant's flowers, okay? What's super cool and weird is that the fig matures, male wasps that have been laid in here come out first, okay? They crawl out, they really don't have wings, they have really big, like, front arms, and they travel in the Stinkonium in search for developing females inside flowers. And what they do is they actually will mate with the females even before they're born. I don't know, this is the weird part, right? So we're not putting any value judgments on these wasps, okay? The poor wasps, right? So he is mating with them even before they come out of the flowers, and then they're not done yet. So after that, that's the weird-looking male, okay? And he comes out, and he will actually dig a hole, a tunnel through the fig wasp wall, and he'll drop out and he'll die, basically. So he's dead. This allows his sisters, basically, to come out and fly out. And in the process of doing that, sometimes they'll get pollen too, and they go to another plant with pollen, and they'll start the whole thing over again. Okay, so some people are like, well, is it true that when I eat a fig, I'm going to eat some wasps, right? That's a big idea. And I'll say it's possible, right? Because there could be dead wasps in there. A lot of the ones that we actually eat don't need sexual reproduction, so that they can have flowers without ever having a fig. So don't freak out about it. And the things that you eat that are crunchy in there, probably not wasps. They're just people are like, oh no. But I show you this because there's clearly some plant tissue being lost here. There's opportunity for flowers to be made, but they never get made. But at the same time, the plant has been selected to nurture these baby wasps so that they can get pollinated later on. So in this case, having some of your flowers eaten, no problem, because I'm getting something in return. Okay, that's a classic kind of mutualism. Here's a picture of what they look like. There's two Stinkonium or Stinkonia. There's the emerging female wasp. She's coming out. They look really, really weird, right? And this is a Moreton Bay fig, so this is from probably Australia. And you can kind of see developing wasps and stuff like that. If you were to eat this one, you probably would have a little bit of extra nutrition in your diet, right? So I'm coming to this case study of this plant. This is the one that I've been working on in the desert Southwest, and I'll just show you what I've been hiding under my coat here is my shirt I got at a thrift store in Tucson while I was doing this work. So this plant is called Datura wrightii. It's also called moonflower because the flower is really white and it only opens up at night. Okay, that a single flower will only open up one night, and then by the morning time, when it's really, really hot in the desert, it shrivels up. Okay, it's also called moonflower because I think native peoples used to eat it. I think they still eat it. You can eat it, and you can hallucinate with that. So maybe you're seeing interesting things about the moon. I would not recommend it because it just seems scary to me. So the flowers last one night. This is pollinated by this thing called a hawk moth or sphinx moth. We have them here. Okay, they're really big honking moths, and they sometimes are scary to me because they come into your vision and you're like, oh, what is that? Oh, it's only a moth. Okay. What is cool here is that the pollinator also lays its eggs on the leaves of this plant. Okay, so we have a case where the leaves are being eaten by the pollinator. Okay, so we have a mutualism here where the pollinator is getting nectar. So what happens is the moth has a huge tongue that goes right into the bottom of that flower, laps up all the nectar, and in the process it gets pollen all over its face, and it flies to another flower. It's helping the plant have sex. At the same time, it's getting food. And not only that, it needs the plant for its babies to eat so that they can develop into the next moth. So it's kind of like the fig example. So here's the picture of one of these moths. It's called Manduca sexta. It's also called the tomato hornworm. If you've ever had tomatoes and you find a gigantic caterpillar on it, it's this moth. They're like this big, right? Sometimes you're like, oh my God, my whole tomato plant has just been eaten. One caterpillar can do that, and it becomes this gigantic moth. So they had this proboscis. They can hover in there. They get the nectar out. It looks like a good mutualism. Here's some other moth-pollinated flowers. This is a cactus called Nightbloomingcereus. Again, that one is actually the same species of moth, Manduca sexta. This is an orchid, so these are also night blooming. You can tell that they don't have any colors, right, because it's nighttime. It really wouldn't help a pollinator find these things. What helps them find the flowers is that they have a lot of scent, a lot of floral scent, and they have a lot of nectar. So if you see those things, these long things coming out behind the orchid, those are called nectar spurs. And in the bottom of those spurs, there's a whole bunch of nectar. So you also need a really long tongue to get in there. My main point with this example is that, again, here's the hornworm. It's called a hornworm because it's got that little horn, cute little horn there. Has to eat the plant. And when it grows up, it pollinates the plant. So it looks like it's going to be bad for the plant, but it's actually good for the plant. So what is going on here? How did this evolve? Well, one thing that my colleagues and I thought was, well, maybe Datura wrightii, the plant, is able to compensate, is really, really tolerant to damage from the caterpillar larvae. That would make sense because it's been selected to support populations of Manduca sexta, so maybe it's able to tolerate this type of damage. So we had a hypothesis where we said if you remove lots of leaf tissue, it shouldn't have much impact on plant reproduction because it needs those caterpillars that are causing the damage to eventually become pollinators. Okay, so this was an experiment that we started in 2009, and this is an awesome picture. This is not from Tucson, but it's from around Phoenix, but you have the classic saguaro cactus. We set this up to happen in the summer when there are things called the summer monsoon. So in the summer around July 1st to the 5th or so, there's these huge rainstorms that can last for hours, and they can destroy roads, they fill up the rivers really quick, so there's a brief period of time in the desert Southwest where it's just like flooding. And this amount of water is thought to really help the plants grow. So our experiment, simply put, is removing tissues from these plants in different amounts and at different times to see if they can tolerate the damage that a caterpillar could make on the plants. And so this is how we set it up. We had 4 different treatment groups, and there's the monsoon rain right there. So we did 2 of them before the rain happened and 2 of them after, thinking that maybe if you were afterwards, you might have some water resources to help you regrow, possibly. It was really hard to capture Manduca sexta, not because they're really fast, but because they're really green, and they're hard to find sometimes. So we decided to use artificial damage to kind of mimic the damage of the caterpillar. So on some of them, we had light amounts of damage. Some of them we had heavy, then we had light, and we had heavy. Right? So we kind of had the same thing replicated before the rains happened and after the rains happened. We also had plants where we didn't cut anything at all because you have to have a control to see what would happen. We called this one early damage, early heavy damage, early low damage, late low damage, and late heavy damage. You don't have to worry about all these. Like, it's very confusing to me, even when I look at this stuff. You just have to realize that some of these are damaged more than others. And so what we looked at was how much growth did they have after the treatments. And indeed, it looks like there's some differences, but you can't even squint your eyes and make this happen. They're not significantly different from each other, okay? So it looked like, at least in growth rates, that having a bunch of your leaves removed actually didn't matter. And then we looked at fruit number, which really does matter if you're trying to get into the next generation. And yes, the controls were pretty high, but there's so much variation among the treatments that there was no significant differences here. We also came back a couple years later to look at fruit number, and then 5 years later to look at fruit number. Again, there was no difference in the number of fruits that were produced, whether or not you had damage to your leaves or not. Okay? So this was some evidence that many plants, here's the takeaway, that many plants show some sort of tolerance in compensation. We know that some of these, not Datura, but other plants have overcompensation, but in Datura retii, they seem to be able to make up for that loss of damage. And we think one of the mechanisms that might be doing this is oftentimes when plants are damaged or things are eaten on the leaves, there's an upregulation of photosynthesis in the area around that leaf or in other leaves on the plant. Sometimes the leaf falls off because the plant has been selected to be like, this leaf's going nowhere, I'm going to drop it off, right? But in some of them, on the other leaves that are left, they often amp up their photosynthetic rates so that they can make up for that type of damage. And so I'm hopefully going to be going back there next year to do some other work looking at Manduca, the moth and the pollinators, to see if damage actually can change the odor of the flower, and that might affect whether a pollinator comes or doesn't come. And this time I'm not going to use Manduca sexta, I'm going to use a different type of insect that also eats the leaves there. It's related to it's a scarab beetle. So if you ever had Japanese beetles, those are scary scarab beetles, right, that eat a lot of tissue. And these ones also can eat a lot of Datura, but I hope to try to figure out, look at the pollinators to see if actually does it affect the floral odor, and does that make it hard for those moths to actually find the plant. So I hope to do that on my sabbatical next year, and after that I'll probably return. This took 10 years to do, so you'll have to wait another decade before you figure that out. It's not my proudest moment, but it did happen. This paper looks like it's going to be coming out, and I think I will end that. Thanks.